The night John Shepard rode into Caldwell, Kansas, Rose Bell was standing on the edge of the saloon's porch with a pistol tucked behind her apron and a prayer tucked behind her teeth, and neither one of those things had ever done her much good before. It was the spring of 1879, and Caldwell sat right along the Kishom Trail like a bead on a string, dusty, loud, full of cattle and commerce and men who thought the world owed them something just because they could hold a gun. Rose had come to Caldwell 3 years earlier with her father, Bernard Bell, who had believed with every fiber of his Methodist heart that a man could build a general store on the edge of the frontier and prosper through honest work. He had been right about the honest work. He had been wrong about the prospering. Bernard Bell died of pneumonia in the winter of 1878, leaving Rose the store, a modest debt to the Caldwell Bank, and the particular loneliness that comes from being a 22-year-old woman who has no family left in a town that does not quite know what to do with her. She had kept the store going. That was the thing people did not understand about Rose Bell. She kept things going. She was not a woman who collapsed under the weight of what life handed her. She was slender and sun-touched. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned neatly at the back of her neck, and eyes that were a brown so warm they looked amber in firelight. She was pretty in a way that made men want to linger at the counter longer than they needed to buy flour or tobacco, but she had perfected the art of being pleasant without being encouraging, and most of the men in Caldwell had learned to respect her edges, even if they did not fully understand them. The night John Shepard rode into town, Rose was not at the store. She had closed it early because Hector Grimm had come by at sundown. Hector Grimm was not a man anyone in Caldwell liked, but he was a man most people tolerated the way you tolerate a stone in your boot when you are a long way from anywhere you can sit down. He ran the cattle brokerage on the south end of town and had, over the past 6 months, been making increasingly pointed suggestions that Rose ought to sell him her store. Since it sat on the corner lot, he needed to expand his operation. His first 3 requests had been polite. The 4th had not been. The 5th, which happened the evening of John Shepard's arrival, had involved Hector walking into the store with 2 of his hired men and telling Rose that she had until the end of the month to accept his offer, or she would find the terms considerably less favorable. Rose had told him, with perfect composure and her hand resting on the counter near where she kept the pistol, that she appreciated his visit and that he was welcome to leave now. He had left. But not before knocking a row of tin cans off the shelf near the door, which Rose chose to interpret as a territorial gesture rather than an accident. She had locked the store, tucked the pistol behind her apron, and walked down to the saloon to find Sheriff Calloway, who she knew spent most of his evenings nursing a whiskey at the bar of the Dust and Bloom Saloon, and pretending this constituted being available for civic duty. She wanted to report what Grimm had said. She wanted it on record. She was not a woman who let threats sit unacknowledged. She had been standing on the porch for approximately 4 minutes, gathering herself before going inside, when John Shepard rode down the main street of Caldwell on a dark bay horse named Cooper, and the whole world seemed, just for a moment, to pause. She noticed him the way you notice lightning, not because you are looking for it, but because it illuminates everything and you cannot help yourself. He sat tall in the saddle with the easy authority of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than off it. He wore a long, dust-darkened coat and a dark hat pulled low, and his jaw was the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved with a deliberate hand. He was lean and broad-shouldered at once, the way men who work hard outdoors sometimes are, and he moved with the particular economy of motion that speaks of someone who has learned not to waste anything, not effort, not words, not time. He pulled Cooper to a stop in front of the saloon, looked up at the building with the mild assessment of someone cataloging information, and then his eyes landed on Rose, standing on the porch with her hand behind her apron watching him. He touched the brim of his hat. "Evening. Evening," she said, because she was Rose Bell and she was not going to be the kind of woman who lost her voice over a stranger's jawline. He dismounted, looped Cooper's reins around the post, and came up the 3 steps to the porch with the unhurried ease of a man who was never in a hurry about anything except possibly the things that mattered most. Up close he was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 26 or 27, with deep-set gray eyes that had a quality of steadiness to them she found both calming and unnerving. "You look like you're deciding something," he said, nodding toward the saloon door. "I'm always deciding something," Rose said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the forerunner of one. "Fair enough. Is it a decision that requires backup, or is it the kind you make alone?" She looked at him properly then, this dusty stranger with his gray eyes and his quiet voice, and she said, "I'm looking for Sheriff Calloway. I have something to report." Something shifted in his expression. "Has something happened to you?" There was a directness in the question that caught her off guard, not nosiness, genuine concern offered plainly and without performance. "Not yet," she said, which was honest, "but I believe something is being planned." He held the door open for her without being asked, which was either good manners or intuition, and she walked inside. The dust and bloom was exactly what it always was: loud, smoky, yellow-lit by oil lamps, full of the smell of whiskey and boot leather and men who had been riding long days. Rose moved through it with practiced confidence, nodding to a few familiar faces, heading for the bar where Sheriff Tom Calloway was indeed sitting with his whiskey, hat pushed back on his head, looking like a man who was very committed to his evening of doing very little. "Sheriff," Rose said, sliding onto the stool beside him, "I need to speak with you about Hector Grimm." Calloway turned. He was a large man, 50 or so, with a gray mustache and a manner that was fundamentally decent even if his ambition was not particularly great. When he saw the expression on Rose's face, he straightened up. "What did he do?" she told him. All of it, including the 2 men Grimm had brought with him and the knocked-over cans, which she described not as accidental. Calloway listened with his big hands wrapped around his glass, his brow creasing. What Rose did not notice, because she was focused on the sheriff, was that John Shepard had followed her inside and had taken a seat at the near end of the bar, ordered a whiskey he was not drinking very much of, and was listening to every word she said with the focused attention of someone who was filing information away. When she was done, Calloway scratched the back of his neck. "Rose, I hear you. But him saying you should sell your store and him being threatening are 2 different things in front of a judge. He brought 2 men into my store after closing, Tom," she said, and she only used his first name when she was making sure he understood she was serious. "2 men he employs, who stood at my door while he told me I would not like the alternative terms. What would you call that?" "I'd call it unpleasant," Calloway said, with the honesty of a man who knew she was right and also knew his own limitations. "I'll go speak to him tomorrow." "Tonight," Rose said. Calloway looked pained. "Rose, the man is across town right now. Tonight, Tom, please." There was a beat of silence. Then a voice from the end of the bar, calm and unhurried, said, "Sheriff, if it helps, I can ride with you." 2 sets of eyes on a conversation like that tend to keep it civil. Both Rose and Calloway turned. John Shepard was looking at them with that steady gray gaze, one hand resting on the bar, his whiskey untouched. Calloway looked at him with the assessment of a man who has learned to read strangers quickly. "You ride the trail." "I've ridden it," John said. "I'm between outfits at the moment." "Name's John Shepard." Something passed over Calloway's face, not recognition exactly, but the ghost of it. "Shepard, you rode with the Hartwell outfit down in Texas." 3 seasons, John said. Calloway nodded slowly, which Rose understood to be significant, though she did not yet know why. "All right," the sheriff said, draining his glass and setting it down. "Shepard, you ride with me. Rose, you go home and lock your door." "I'd rather," Rose began. "Go home and lock your door," Calloway repeated, and his tone was kind but final. "I'll come by the store first thing in the morning and tell you how it went." Rose pressed her lips together, recognized that this was the best she was going to get tonight, and stood up from the stool. She looked at John Shepard as she did, meaning to offer a polite acknowledgement of his offer to help and nothing more. But when she looked at him, he was already looking at her, and the look he gave her was not the appraising look men usually gave her. It was something quieter, something that felt more like recognition than examination. "Thank you," she said to him, and she meant it. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "I haven't done anything." "You offered," she said. "Out here that counts for something." He looked at her a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he nodded, and Rose Bell walked out of the dust and bloom saloon into the warm Kansas night with something fluttering in her chest that she told herself was anxiety about Grim, and was not, even slightly, related to gray eyes. She did not sleep particularly well. She lay in her small room above the store and listened to the sounds of Caldwell at night, horses, voices, the distant music from the saloon, and thought about Hector Grim and what he was capable of. And thought, too, about a man who had offered to ride with the sheriff on behalf of a woman he had never met, in a town he had never been in before, for no reason she could identify except that it had seemed to him like the right thing to do. In the morning, Calloway came as promised. He sat at the little table in the back of the store and told Rose that he and Shepard had found Grim at his brokerage, that the conversation had been pointed and official, and that Grim had been informed in unambiguous terms that any further attempts to intimidate Rose Bell would be treated as a legal matter. "You think it'll stick?" Rose asked, handing Calloway a cup of coffee. "For now," Calloway said. "Grim's careful. He's not going to do anything obvious. But I'd feel better if someone was keeping an eye on things around here." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "Shepard's looking for work. He's a good man. I know his reputation from down south, and it's solid. I was thinking maybe you could use someone to help with hauling and loading, and it wouldn't hurt to have him around the store a few hours a day." Rose looked at the sheriff for a long moment. She was not the kind of woman who needed a guardian. She was also not the kind of woman who let pride get in the way of practical thinking. There was a difference between needing protection and having a capable person nearby, and the store did genuinely need more hands than she had. "What does he want for wages?" she asked. "Said he'd talk to you about it himself," Calloway said. "He's outside." Rose looked up. John Shepard was standing outside her store window, apparently examining the display of dry goods she had arranged there, with the studied nonchalance of a man who was pretending he had not been waiting. She went to the door and opened it. "Mr. Shepard," she said. "Miss Bell," he said, turning from the window. "The sheriff tells me you're looking for work." For the moment, he was straightforward about it. "I ride out again in the fall, but I've got the summer free and I've done plenty of loading and hauling. I don't take up much space and I don't cause trouble." She looked at him, he looked back. The morning light was different from the lantern-lit saloon. In daylight she could see that his gray eyes had a slight warmth in them, silver rather than cold, and that there was a scar along his jawline she had not noticed before, old and white, the kind that came from something sharp. "I pay fair wages," she said. "Not generous, but fair. The debt on this store requires that I be careful." "I don't need generous," he said. "Fair is fine. And you understand that you work for me, not with me, not near me. For me, I make the decisions about this store." Something that might have been approval moved in his expression. "Understood completely." "Then come inside," Rose said, "and I'll show you where everything is." That was how it began, not with fanfare or fireworks, with a cup of coffee and a tour of a general store in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879. The first weeks were professional and careful. John arrived each morning, did the work she set him to, hauling supplies from the weekly freight delivery, stacking shelves, managing the storage room, occasionally serving customers when Rose was occupied with the accounts, and left each evening with his wages and not much more conversation than was required by the tasks. He was efficient and quiet and utterly reliable, which Rose, who had spent 3 years managing everything alone, found almost disconcertingly pleasant. But things happened, as things do, and the professional carefulness began to soften. It started one Tuesday in late April when the freight delivery arrived 2 hours late with a wagon wheel that had come loose on the road and needed to be repaired before anything could be unloaded. The freight driver, An older man named Abe could not manage the repair alone. John had the wheel back on inside 40 minutes, working in the midday heat without complaint, and Rose, who had been watching from the store entrance, brought him a cup of water and said, "Where did you learn that?" "My father ran a small ranch in Missouri," he said, accepting the water. "You learn to fix what breaks because there's no one else to do it." "Is your family still in Missouri?" A brief pause, the kind that contains something it doesn't want to say. "My father passed about 8 years ago. My mother remarried and moved east. I don't have much family to speak of." Rose nodded, understanding the particular weight of that sentence. "I don't either," she said. "My father died last winter." He looked at her then, not with the quick condolence people usually offered, the reflexive sorry for your loss that felt like a social obligation, but with genuine, quiet recognition. "I'm sorry," he said, and it sounded like he meant it in the way that only people who have also lost someone can truly mean it. "Thank you," she said. They stood there a moment in the April heat, two people who had each arrived at solitude by different roads, and something shifted between them. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way ground shifts underground before the surface shows any sign of it. He started staying a little later in the evenings, not because she asked him to, but because there was often something to be finished, and finishing things was apparently something he was constitutionally unable to leave undone. She started leaving the back door unlocked an extra hour before it had to be secured, not because she needed to, but because it meant there was more time for the things to be finished. They talked while they worked. That was how they learned each other, in the sideways fashion of two people who are not ready to look directly at the thing that is happening. She learned that he had started working cattle drives at 17, that he had ridden the Kishom Trail 4 times going north, that he was methodical about practical things and surprisingly thoughtful about human ones. He learned that she had grown up in Ohio, that she had come west with her father and left behind a life she had not been unhappy with but had not been entirely satisfied by either, that she read whenever she could and kept 3 books on the counter of the store that she would pick up in the quiet midday hours. "What are you reading now?" He asked her one evening in early May when they were both in the storage room taking inventory, she with her ledger and he with the crates. She held up the book. "Great Expectations," she said. "I've read it twice before." He glanced at the cover. "Do you usually read things twice?" "Only the ones that give you different things at different ages," she said. "When I was 16, I thought it was a book about ambition. Now I think it's a book about self-deception." He considered this seriously, which she appreciated. "You read?" "When I can," he said. "I've got a Bible and a book of maps. That's about all I carry." "A book of maps," she repeated, a little charmed by this despite herself. "I like knowing where things are," he said simply, "and where they lead." She looked at him over the ledger and he was looking at her, and for just a moment neither of them was thinking about inventory at all. The town of Caldwell noticed. Small towns always notice. Mrs. Hattie Prout, who ran the boarding house and collected information the way other people collected furniture, had informed 3 separate people by the end of May that Rose Bell and that Shepard boy were getting on very well, delivered with the particular tone that meant she thought it was more than getting on. Deputy Frank Akers, who was young and well-meaning and a little slow, had asked Sheriff Calloway if he thought Shepard was sweet on the Bell woman, to which Calloway had replied that it was none of Frank's business, which Frank took as a yes. Rose was aware of what people were saying. She was not particularly troubled by it, because her reputation in Caldwell was solid enough to withstand conversation, and because nothing inappropriate was happening, only a great deal of not quite admitting that something was happening. What changed things was the evening of the 15th of May. It had been a long day. A rancher from the north had come in with a list of supplies that took 2 hours to fill, and then there had been an issue with the accounts that Rose had to untangle line by line, and by the time she closed the store the sun was already setting and she had a headache pressing behind her eyes. She sat down on the low step of the back door, which faced a small alley, and then the open prairie beyond the edge of town, and she pressed her fingers to her temples and breathed. John came around the side of the building. He had been securing the freight wagon and stopped when he saw her. "You all right?" he asked. "Headache," she said. "I just need a moment." He did not tell her to go inside and rest, which other people would have said and which would have annoyed her. He sat down on the step beside her, not so close that it was inappropriate, just close enough that she was aware of him being there. He had removed his hat and his dark hair was slightly damp from the heat of the day, and he rested his forearms on his knees and looked out at the long, flat Kansas prairie, gold in the evening light. "When I was on the drives," he said after a minute, "the best part of any day was this. The light going, everything settling. The cattle were down and the coffee was on, and it didn't matter for a little while what needed doing." She looked at the prairie too. The light really was extraordinary, that deep golden amber that the Kansas plains produced in the evenings, flat and vast and unutterably peaceful. The headache was receding a little. "Do you miss it?" she asked. The drives, he thought about it honestly, which she had noticed was something he always did. He did not give quick, comfortable answers. "I miss the movement," he said. "I don't miss the alone." Rose turned her head to look at him. He was still looking at the prairie. "Have you ever," she started and then stopped herself. "What?" he said. She had been going to ask if he had ever considered staying somewhere, putting down roots. She reconsidered because it felt too direct, too revealing of what she was actually thinking about. "Have you ever been to the mountains?" she said instead. "The Rockies." "Once, coming back from a drive that went west." He turned his head to look at her, and their faces were closer than they had been in any previous moment, and neither of them moved away. "There's something else. You'd love them." "I've never been anywhere but Ohio and Kansas," she admitted. "You will," he said, with a quiet certainty that was not at all a promise, because John Shepard, as all of Caldwell knew by that point from various conversations and the general way he presented himself to the world, did not make promises. This was something Calloway had mentioned when he first described John to Rose, and something several other people had confirmed without being asked. He was a good man, they said. Steady and decent, and someone you could rely on for the thing he said he would do in that moment. But he did not make promises. He did not commit to futures. He had been asked once, by a rancher's wife who liked to probe at people, why not, and he had said that a promise is a debt, and that he had seen too many men crush themselves and the people they loved under the weight of promises they could not keep. He had decided early that he would rather say nothing than say too much. Rose knew this. She had heard it, and sitting on that back step in the evening light with his gray eyes on her face and that warm certainty in his voice, she told herself it didn't mean anything. He was not promising her mountains. He was making an observation, but she kept it regardless. She folded it up and kept it somewhere she did not look at often enough to acknowledge. June arrived, and with it, the full summer heat of the southern Kansas plains. The store was busy, trail season was well underway, and Caldwell was flooded with cattlemen and drovers and merchants following the cattle north. Rose worked long days and John worked them alongside her, and the rhythm they had established became something so natural that she occasionally caught herself noticing its absence on Sundays, which was the one day he did not come in. She also caught herself, on those Sundays, cleaning and reorganizing things that did not need organizing, and acknowledging privately and reluctantly that she was doing so because it gave her something to do other than notice that the store was very quiet. Hector Grimm had been quiet since Calloway and John had paid him their visit. Not gone, Rose could see him sometimes, across the street or at the other end of the main road, watching the store with the particular evaluating look of a man who has not abandoned a plan but is adjusting its timeline. She mentioned this to John once. "He's waiting," John said, without looking up from the shelf he was stocking. "Waiting for what?" "For something to change," he said. "Either for you to get tired or for some circumstance to shift in his favor. Men like that don't quit, they recalculate." "What a comforting thought," Rose said. He did look up then, and the look was direct and steady. "You know about it now, so you're not surprised by it. That's better. "You're very practical," she said. "I try to be." "Does it ever get lonely?" she asked, and she did not mean the practicality exactly, and they both knew it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, just that, simple and unadorned." And he went back to stocking the shelf, and Rose went back to the counter, and neither of them said anything else about it. But something had been confirmed between them that had previously only been suspected. The Saturday at the end of June was the night of the summer social, which the town held in the open lot beside the church every year. It was a community gathering music and food, and the general sociability that people on the frontier treasured more intensely than people in crowded cities, because out here the distance between one soul and another was measurable in actual miles. Rose had not planned to go because she had planned to finish the quarterly accounts, but Mrs. Pruitt had come by the store that afternoon and told her in the direct manner of a woman who has decided something that fresh air and company would do her good, and that a young woman who spent every evening with her ledger was not doing herself any favors, and that furthermore the Caldwell Ladies' Aid Society had made 3 pies and she, Rose, had contributed funds to the flour used in those pies, and therefore had a civic obligation to eat some. This argument was both ridiculous and unanswerable, and Rose found herself at the social by 7:30, wearing the best of her 3 good dresses, which was a deep rose-colored cotton that she had privately always liked because the color suited her hair. She had assumed John would not be there. He was not a social gathering sort of person, or at least she had assumed he was not. She had been forming a great many assumptions about what John Shepard was and was not, she realized, as she stood with Mrs. Pruitt near the pie table and looked across the lot and found him standing with Calloway and 2 other men on the far side, looking completely at ease. He was wearing a clean shirt. The dark coat was gone in the summer heat, and she could see that he was broad-shouldered and lean, and that the clean shirt was a dark blue that made his eyes, when he glanced up and saw her look very gray indeed. He saw her at the same moment she saw him, and the same suspended moment that had happened on the saloon porch in May happened again, slightly longer this time. He said something to Calloway, and Calloway looked toward Rose and nodded, and John crossed the lot. "Miss Bell," he said when he reached her. "Mr. Shepard," she said, and Mrs. Pruitt, who missed absolutely nothing, smiled into her punch cup. "You look well," he said, with the careful understatement of a man who was choosing his words extremely deliberately. "Thank you," she said, with the careful composure of a woman who was choosing hers with equal deliberateness. "I didn't know you were coming." "I didn't know you were either," he said, "but here we both are." Mrs. Pruitt excused herself with transparent haste and absolutely zero subtlety. And then it was just the 2 of them beside the pie table, with the fiddle starting up across the lot, and the warm, dark summer night all around them. They ate pie and talked, and this was different from talking in the store because there was no task to attach the conversation to, no shelves to stock or accounts to reference. This was just talking for its own sake, and Rose found herself laughing at something he said about a cattle drive in Texas in which an extremely stubborn steer had caused what he described as a diplomatic incident with a neighboring ranch, and his expression when she laughed was the one she had been carefully not looking for something unguarded and pleased and entirely undone by it. "You're funny," she said when she had recovered herself. "I hadn't expected that." "I'm not usually," he said. "In the usual circumstances, I don't have much occasion for it." "What are the unusual circumstances?" she asked. He looked at her, and the gray eyes were very clear and direct. "Present company," he said. Rose looked back at him and did not try to make anything smaller than it was. When the fiddle struck up a reel, several couples moved to the cleared space in the middle of the lot. Rose watched them and felt something she could identify as wistfulness. She had loved to dance when she was younger in Ohio, when there had been socials with her cousins and neighbors, and enough familiar faces that everything felt safe and mapped. "Do you dance?" she asked, without quite meaning to ask it aloud. "Badly," John said, "but if you're willing to risk it, I'm willing to try." She turned to him. "Really? I said badly, not never. She laughed, and he offered her his hand with the gravity of a man making a formal commitment to some small and ridiculous undertaking, and she took it, and they joined the other couples on the makeshift dance floor. He was, in fact, not bad. He was careful and measured and let her lead a little more than was traditional, which she found she appreciated. His hand was warm on her back, and his grip on her other hand was firm and easy, and they moved through the reel with more success than she had expected and ended it both slightly breathless and grinning. "You said badly," she said. "Compared to the standard I was comparing myself to," he said. "That was badly." "Who were you comparing yourself to?" "A man from the Hartwell outfit who could do a reel like it was water running downhill," he said. "Name was Martinez. He once danced for 4 hours straight at a celebration in San Antonio. That's an extraordinary comparison to set yourself against." "I have high standards," he said, and the way he said it made her understand he was not talking about dancing anymore. She looked at him. He looked at her. The fiddle started another tune, slower this time, and around them some couples paired off for the slower dance and others drifted away, and John and Rose stood still in the middle of it all in a pocket of charged quiet. "Rose," he said, and it was the first time he had used only her given name, without the miss, and it sounded different, intimate in the precise way that first names are when someone has been carefully avoiding them. "Yes," she said. He looked at her with the steady regard she had come to trust and said, "I don't do this easily, talking to people the way I talk to you. I want you to know I'm aware that's what's happening." She felt something very warm move through her chest. "What is happening?" she asked, because she wanted to hear him say it, this man who chose every word with such deliberateness. "Something I didn't plan on," he said. "When I rode into this town, something that matters." She was quiet for a moment, holding this. Then she said, "Something that matters is an interesting way to put it for a man who doesn't make promises." His expression shifted slightly. "You know about that." "Everyone in Caldwell knows about that." He was quiet, and she could see him working through it, the way he worked through everything, methodically and honestly. "It's not that I don't care about things," he said finally. "It's that I've seen what happens when a man promises a thing he can't deliver on. My father promised my mother they would build a fine life in Missouri, and he died owing the bank more than the land was worth, and she had nothing. The promise wasn't wrong because he didn't mean it. It was wrong because he couldn't keep it. And so you make no promises," Rose said, not accusingly but seriously. "I have not," he said. "In 26 years, I have not made a single promise I didn't know I could keep." "And tonight," she said. It was a quiet dare, and she was aware of it being one. He looked at her for a long moment, the fiddle playing softly, the Kansas stars vast and brilliant overhead. "Tonight," he said, "I want to promise you that I will not disappear on you, that whatever this is and wherever it goes, I will not be the man who rides out without telling you, that you will not wake up one morning and find me gone without a word. That much I can promise, because that much I know I can keep." Rose Bell stood in the summer night in Caldwell, Kansas, and looked at John Shepard, who had been known across 3 states as the cowboy who never made promises, and felt the weight and precision of what he had just offered her, and understood it for exactly what it was. Not a sweeping declaration, not a false future sketched in romantic terms that had no foundation under them. A real promise, carefully chosen, given by a man who only gave what he was certain he could give. On the very first night they had been alone together as anything other than employer and employee. It was, she thought, the most meaningful thing anyone had ever said to her. "I believe you," she said, and she did. They walked home separately, because it was 1879 and Caldwell was not a city, and appearances were something Rose managed carefully. But he walked her to the door of the store and stood on the step while she unlocked it, and when she turned to say good night, he was close enough that she could see the exact shade of his eyes in the darkness. "Good night, Rose," he said. "Good night, John," she said, and stepped inside. She stood with her back against the closed door in the dark of the store for a full 30 seconds before she allowed herself to feel everything she had been holding carefully at arm's length for the past 2 months. It felt, she decided, exactly like standing at the edge of a very beautiful and very large thing with no guarantee of how deep it went. And she had never been a woman who flinched at depth. July moved through Caldwell with a particular ferocity. The heat was absolute and the trail traffic was at its peak, and the store was more profitable than it had been at any point since Rose had taken over the accounts. She was good at business. She had her father's head for numbers and her own instinct for what people needed before they knew they needed it. And by mid-July, she had the beginning of a real cushion against the bank debt. She and John moved through July in the new language that had developed between them since the social closer than colleagues, openly fond, taking care in the way that small-town propriety required while being unable, in those moments when they were working together in the quiet of the store, to be anything other than what they were, which was two people who were falling in love with each other in the unhurried and complete way that is only possible when you have gotten to know someone slowly enough to actually see them. There was an afternoon in the third week of July when a thunderstorm came in fast from the west, the way Kansas storms do, sudden and theatrical and total. Rose was in the store alone because John had gone to the mill to collect a grain order, and the storm hit before he could get back, turning the main street of Caldwell into a river of mud and filling the air with thunder that shook the window glass. He came back 20 minutes later, completely soaked through, carrying the grain on his back because the wagon had gotten mired in the mud on the road, and he had not wanted to leave the order. He walked in the back door of the store looking like something the storm had particularly enjoyed, and Rose stared at him and then burst out laughing before she could stop herself. "It's raining," he said, with considerable dignity, setting the grain down. "Yes," she said, managing her laughter into something more composed. "I see that. The wagon is in the road," he said. "It will need to be pulled out when the rain eases." "I see that too," she said, going to the back room and coming back with a towel which she handed to him. He took it with the gravity of a man who would not dignify the circumstances by commenting on them further. She put water on the small stove in the back room. She kept a pot there in winter, but in July it was rarely used, and made coffee while he dried off, and they sat in the back room listening to the storm rage outside, and it was one of those ordinary moments that is not ordinary at all. That is in fact a kind of grace, the specific grace of being somewhere warm and safe with someone you are glad to be near. "My mother was afraid of storms," John said, holding his coffee cup. "Every time one came, my father would sit with her until it was done. He never made fun of her for it, never acted like it was an imposition. He just sat there." Rose looked at him. "You miss him," she said. "Yes," he said simply. He was not a man who got everything right, but he was present. That mattered. Rose thought of her own father, who had been present in exactly that same way, not always correct, sometimes stubborn, occasionally baffling, but there. The loss of that specific presence was something she could not describe to people who had not experienced it. "I know what you mean," she said. They finished their coffee. The storm passed. John went and got the wagon out of the mud with the help of a man from the neighboring tannery. He came back to finish the afternoon's work, and when he left in the evening he paused at the door and said, "Rose." She looked up from the ledger. "I meant to ask," he said, with the careful phrasing of a man who has been building to something for some time, "whether you might want to have supper with me Sunday. Not at the saloon. I can cook tolerably well, and Mrs. Prout said I can use the boarding-house kitchen if I ask her, which I did." Rose looked at him. She was aware that this was a significant gesture on every front. He had planned it, arranged it, asked Mrs. Prout, which meant he was willing to be public about it. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." The smile that moved across his face was slow and genuine, and lit his gray eyes in a way she had not seen before. And she kept that too, folded away with the mountains and the promise. Sunday supper at Mrs. Prout's boarding-house dining room was everything it needed to be, simply made, carefully done, accompanied by Mrs. Prout herself appearing at irregular intervals with additional bread and questions that were thinly disguised data collection. John bore this with amiable patience and Rose with knowing amusement, and between the appearances of Mrs. Pruitt and the bread they talked for 3 hours about things both large and small. What Rose hoped to do with the store in the future, what John had seen in his years on the trail, what parts of the country they each wanted to see, what they each believed about the kind of life worth building. This was the conversation, Rose thought afterward, where she understood he was not a man who came without depth. He had thought about things. He had opinions about the railroad and what it was doing to the cattle towns and the people who depended on them. He had thoughts about the treatment of the native peoples that were more considered and more troubled than most men she knew in 1879, who tended to view those questions through the comfortable lens of manifest destiny. John had been on the trail long enough to see what was actually happening to the Comanche and the Kiowa as the frontier closed in, and he spoke about it with a directness and a sadness that told her he had not made his peace with it. "A lot of men don't think about it at all," she said. "That's easier," he said. "Doesn't make it right." She looked at him across the table with the full warmth of what she felt for him, which by that Sunday in late July was substantial and specific, and entirely beyond the point of being manageable at arm's length anymore. He walked her back to the store that evening, and they stood on the front porch in the last of the daylight. He was holding his hat in both hands and watching her, and she was looking at him, and the thing between them was fully present and fully acknowledged even though they had not yet spoken it directly. "I want to court you properly," he said, "with your permission." "John," she said, "I think you have been courting me since the day you sat down on my back step and told me about the light going out on the cattle drive." He looked briefly arrested by this, as if she had shown him something about himself he had not quite seen. Then he said, "Is that a yes?" "It is very much a yes," she said. He smiled, and it was the fullest smile she had seen from him, and she thought, there it is. There is the whole of him behind all that quietness. August was extraordinary. They spent their days working the store together, and their evenings in each other's company, walking the edge of town where the prairie opened up, sitting on the back step in the twilight, having supper twice a week that alternated between Mrs. Pruitt's kitchen and the one simple restaurant Caldwell possessed. They held hands on the walk home from these suppers, which was enough in terms of public display to give Mrs. Pruitt and the rest of Caldwell an enormous amount to talk about, and to make Rose feel that her heart was doing something quite unusual inside her chest every single time. He kissed her for the first time on a Wednesday evening in the middle of August, on the back step of the store, when the stars were out and the night was warm, and they had been sitting close together for an hour in the easy comfort that had replaced any earlier awkwardness. He had turned to say something, and she had been looking at him, and they had been very close. And instead of saying whatever he had been going to say, he had paused and then asked, very quietly if he might. She had answered by closing the distance herself, because she had never been the kind of woman who waited passively for things to happen when she knew what she wanted. And he had made a soft sound that was almost surprise, and then had kissed her back with a steadiness and warmth that felt exactly like him, present and sure and not performing anything for anyone, just entirely there. When they finally separated, she pressed her forehead to his, and they were both quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I have been thinking about that since June." "I have been thinking about it since May," she said, and felt him smile against her temple. What Rose had not been paying enough attention to in August was Hector Grimm. She had assumed that Calloway's visit had resolved the immediate threat. She had underestimated, as John had warned her she might, the patience and recalculation of a man who wanted something and was willing to take a long view. On a Friday in the last week of August, one of Grimm's hired men came into the store when Rose was alone. John was at the mill, and presented her with a formal legal document. It was from the Caldwell Bank. It was a notice that her outstanding loan had been called in early, the full balance due within 30 days. Under a clause, she had not paid sufficient attention to that allowed the bank to recall the loan if the property was deemed to be in insufficient financial standing. Rose read the document twice, carefully, while the hired man watched with the smug expression of a messenger who knows the message is bad news for the recipient. When she was done reading, she looked up and said, very calmly, "Tell Mr. Grimm that I received this." The man left. Rose sat down on the stool behind the counter and looked at the document and did the arithmetic in her head. The loan balance was $420. She had at this moment approximately $160 in the store account. The summer had been profitable, but it had not been that profitable, not yet. When John came back from the mill, she was still at the counter with the document in front of her. He read it without being asked, because she handed it to him when he walked in and said, "Read this," and he read it with the careful attention he gave everything. "Grimm," he said when he finished. "The bank president is Marcus Webb," Rose said. "He and Grimm play cards together every Thursday evening. I know because Calloway mentioned it once." John put the document down on the counter. "What do you want to do?" She looked at him, grateful to the bottom of herself that he had asked what she wanted to do and not told her what to do. "I want to fight it," she said, "but I need to know if I can." "What's the full balance?" she told him. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched something move across his face that she could not immediately read. "I have $300 saved," he said, "from the past 3 seasons on the trail." Rose stared at him. "John, I'm not giving it to you," he said quickly and precisely. "I'm offering it as a partnership investment. You pay me back when the store turns it at whatever rate is fair." "That's business, not charity." She looked at him for a long time. "You were planning to use that money when you rode out in the fall." He held her gaze. "Plans change." She understood the weight of what he was saying. He had been planning to leave Caldwell in the fall. She had always known this, had been holding it in the back of her mind as a thing that was coming and that she did not know how to address. He had $300 saved and a fall departure and a life on the trail that he had told her plainly he was returning to. And he was sitting here offering to invest every saved dollar he had in her store. "If you put your money into this store," she said slowly, "you don't have a fall departure." "No," he said, "I don't." "John," she put her hand over his on the counter, "you need to be sure about that. I need you to be sure about that, not because of the money but because of what it means." He turned his hand over under hers and held it and looked at her with those steady gray eyes. "Rose," he said, "I have been sure about it since June. The money is practical, the staying is not. The staying is because I am in love with you, and I have been since I sat on that back step and you asked me if I missed the drives." The store was quiet. Outside, Caldwell went about its business. "You are," she said, not because she was surprised but because she wanted to hear it again. "I am," he said, "absolutely." She pressed her lips together and her eyes were bright, and she said, "I am in love with you too, since probably longer than June if I'm being honest." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a gentleness that made something in her chest open completely, and then he looked at her and said, "Then we have a loan to deal with." They dealt with it together. The next morning they went to the bank together, walked into Marcus Webb's office together, and Rose placed her payment plan on the desk. John's $300 combined with her $160, plus a documented revenue projection for September and October that was, in Rose's honest assessment, achievable. She presented it with the precision of a woman who knew her own business down to the last cent and was not going to be flustered out of it. Webb, to his credit, was not unreasonable. He was a banker before he was Grimm's card partner, and Rose's numbers were solid, and the combined sum she placed on his desk was real money. He agreed to rescind the recall and hold the original terms. When they walked out of the bank into the bright September morning, John put his hand at the small of her back and said, "Well done." "We did it together," she said. "You did the numbers," he said. "I just provided the ammunition." She looked up at him, squinting in the sun, and he was smiling his slow, full smile, and she thought, "This is what it is. This is what it looks like. Someone who adds their weight to yours when you need it and steps back when you don't and knows the difference." Hector Grimm was livid, which Calloway reported with some satisfaction 3 days later. He had apparently gone to the bank to discover that the recall had been resolved and had expressed his displeasure in terms that were, in Calloway's diplomatic description, fairly vivid. But there was nothing Grimm could legally do. The loan was settled. The store was secure. He was left with his recalculated patience and considerably fewer options. Calloway also told them during this conversation that he had been making quiet inquiries about Grimm's other business practices and had turned up some irregularities in the way he was settling accounts with the drovers underweighting cattle, essentially, which was both common and illegal, and which Calloway intended to look into further through the State Cattle Commission. "He won't be a problem much longer," Calloway said, with the satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for leverage. He was right. By October, the Cattle Commission investigation had reached a point where Grimm was facing serious legal exposure, and his attention shifted entirely from Rose's store to his own survival. He never bothered her again. By the following spring he would sell his brokerage and leave Caldwell entirely, which suited the town perfectly. But in September 1879, none of that was resolved yet, and what was happening was that John Shepard, who had ridden into Caldwell in May with a horse named Cooper and a plan to ride out again in the fall, was not riding out in the fall. He went to Calloway in early September and asked about permanent work as a deputy, and Calloway, who had been hoping for exactly this and managing not to show it, said yes with the speed of a man who had been keeping his eagerness strictly under control. Rose found out about this when John told her himself the same evening, sitting on the back step of the store in the September dusk which had started to cool toward autumn. "Deputy," she said. "It suits what I can do," he said, "and I know this town now, and Calloway is a fair man to work for." "And it keeps you in Caldwell," she said. "Yes," he said, "it keeps me in Caldwell." She leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her and they sat there in the early autumn evening, and the big Kansas sky went dark above them and filled with stars, and Rose thought about the night he had ridden in on Cooper, and she had been standing on the saloon porch with a pistol and a prayer, and how entirely impossible it would have been to predict, standing there, that this was what was coming. "You promised me you wouldn't disappear," she said. His arm tightened slightly. "I remember." "You kept it," she said. "I told you I would," he said. She tilted her head up and he looked down at her, and it was the most natural thing in the world when he kissed her there on the back step, unhurried, with the stars coming out above them and Caldwell settling into its nighttime sounds around them. October in Caldwell had a particular quality, the trail traffic thinning as the season closed, the air sharpening toward cold, the town becoming more itself as the transient population moved on. Rose loved October. The store slowed enough that she could breathe, and she used the quieter hours to restructure the accounts properly now that the debt situation had stabilized, and to order ahead for winter, and to sit with a cup of tea and her book in the slow midday when there were no customers. John was learning deputy work with the same methodical competence he brought to everything. He rode out with Calloway 2 or 3 times a week to deal with whatever required the law's attention. A dispute between 2 ranchers over a property line, a drunk who needed to sleep somewhere that was not the middle of the road, the ordinary maintenance of civil order in a cattle town at the edge of the frontier. He was good at it. He had, Rose thought, always had a quality of settled authority about him that made people cooperate, not because he was imposing, but because there was something in his manner that communicated both fairness and resolution, and people responded to that. He also, in October, began to have conversations with Rose of a particular kind, future-shaped conversations, the ones that were no longer about what was happening now, but about what might happen later. They happened the way their best conversations always happened, sideways, attached to something else, neither of them quite looking directly at the thing. One evening they were walking the edge of town where the prairie began, as they often did, and John was quiet in a way that she had learned meant he was working towards something. "What is it?" she asked. "I'm trying to find the right words," he said. "Take your time," she said, because she had learned that he needed to. He was quiet for another moment and then he said, "I want to build something here. Not just work here, build something, a real life." He stopped walking and turned to face her in the last light. "With you. I want to build it with you. I'm not going to ride out again, Rose. Not for the trail, not for any other reason. I'm asking you if you'll let me build it with you." Rose looked at him in the failing light, this man who had ridden in from nowhere on a dark bay horse, who never made promises because he would not make them if he couldn't keep them, who had made her one on the very first night and had not broken it. "Are you asking me to marry you, John Shepard?" she said. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a ring, simple, gold, a small stone that caught the last of the light, and held it in his palm between them. "I am asking you to marry me, Rose Bell," he said. She looked at the ring and looked at him and felt the whole of the past month settle into something clear and certain and right. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He put the ring on her finger and then pulled her close and held her there in the open prairie with Caldwell behind them and the vast Kansas sky going dark overhead. And she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt something she could only describe as the particular peace of having arrived. They were married on the 14th of November, 1879, in the Caldwell Methodist Church, which was small and plain and exactly right. Calloway stood up with John, and Mrs. Prout, who wept through the whole ceremony with an enthusiasm that suggested she felt personally responsible for the outcome, stood up with Rose. The congregation was the people of Caldwell who had become, over 3 years, the closest thing to family Rose had found since she lost her father, the freight driver Abe, and Deputy Frank Akers, and the woman who ran the laundry and had always been kind, and several of the ranchers' wives who had come to like Rose enormously, and a dozen others whose names and faces had become the landscape of her daily life. John Shepard said his vows with the steadiness he brought to every promise, which was to say, with absolute certainty, looking her directly in the eyes, meaning every word. Rose said hers with a warmth that made several people in the congregation quietly produce handkerchiefs they had brought for exactly this purpose, because Rose Bell was not a woman who hid things when they mattered, and on this occasion everything mattered. After the ceremony there was a dinner at Mrs. Prout's boarding house, which Mrs. Prout had organized with a ferocity of goodwill that resulted in an amount of food that could have fed the whole town 3 times over, and dancing in the cleared front room, and the kind of noise and warmth and belonging that Rose had not felt since she was a girl in Ohio with her family around her, and which was now restored to her in a different form, but no less real. John danced with her twice. He had been practicing, which she could tell, and was demonstrably better than he had been at the summer social. And Calloway gave a toast that was brief and heartfelt, and made John look sideways at the floor with the particular expression of a man who is genuinely moved, and is managing it with dignity. They moved into a small house on the west side of Caldwell that John had located in October, and spent 2 weekends getting into reasonable condition. It was not large, 2 rooms and a kitchen and a porch, but it was solid and it was theirs, and Rose put curtains on the windows and her 3 books on the shelf, and a pot of coffee on the stove on the first morning, and John stood in the kitchen doorway watching her and looking like a man who could not quite believe his good fortune, which was something Rose fully and precisely understood, because she felt exactly the same. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was not harsh enough to be punishing, but cold enough to make a warm house and good company feel like a particular luxury. They settled into the life of it. Rose ran the store, which continued to grow steadily. John worked his deputy shifts with Calloway, who was increasingly glad of the reliable help, and in the evenings they came home to each other and made supper and talked and read and were quiet together in the way that only possible when you are completely comfortable with another person. He read her book when she finished it, Great Expectations, and gave it back to her with his assessment, which was that he thought she was right. It was a book about self-deception, but also about the possibility of correcting it, which he found more interesting. She looked at him with the specific delight that comes from having someone meet you in the things you love. She taught him to keep better accounts than he had ever kept for himself, because he had always been careless with money except for saving it, and he was an excellent student who asked good questions. He taught her to ride better than she had previously known how to, which was not saying much since she had only ever ridden functionally before, and she discovered with some surprise that she loved it, the prairie opening up in all directions, the wind, the particular freedom of being on horseback in open country. In the spring of 1880, Rose discovered she was pregnant. She told John on a Sunday morning over coffee in the kitchen, watching his face carefully as she said it, and what she saw there was a joy so simple and complete that it moved her to tears, which surprised them both, because she was not generally a woman who cried easily. He came around the table and held her and said, "Is this all right? Are you all right?" "I'm wonderful," she said into his shoulder. It's a lot." "Yes," he said, "it is." He held her for a good long while in the morning kitchen, and then he made her another cup of coffee and sat across from her, and they talked about it. What needed to be planned, what would change, how they felt, which was both exhilarated and something that could only be described as awe. The pregnancy progressed through the spring and summer without serious difficulty. Rose continued running the store until August, when the heat and the sheer logistics of being 9 months pregnant in Kansas made it necessary to hand the day-to-day management over to a young man named Thomas Greer, whom she had hired in the spring as an assistant, and who had proven reliable enough that she trusted him with the operation. John hovered. He did not hover in the way that drove her to distraction. He was too attuned to her for that, but he was present with an additional intensity that she found both sweet and occasionally amusing. He had read everything he could find on the subject, which in Caldwell in 1880 was not a great deal, and had engaged the services of Mrs. Alma Bradley, who had delivered half the babies born in the county, and whom Rose found enormously reassuring. Their son was born on the 2nd of September, 1880, in the house on the west side of Caldwell, with Mrs. Bradley in attendance and John in the next room doing very poorly at being calm. He was a healthy boy, round-faced and loud, with a suggestion of his father's gray eyes and his mother's auburn hair, and when John was allowed in and Rose put the baby in his arms, the expression on John Shepard's face was something that defied description, something that made Rose, exhausted and wrung out and luminous, think, there it all is. What do we call him?" John said, very quietly, looking at the baby with the wonder of a man who has been confronted with something he has no existing category for. "I want to call him Bernard," Rose said, for her father. John looked at her and his throat moved. "Bernard Shepard," he said. "That's a fine name." Bernard Henry Shepard, who went by Ben from the very first moment anyone attempted to address him as anything, was loud and vigorous and took deeply personally any suggestion that he should sleep when people expected him to. Rose navigated this with the same pragmatic resolve with which she navigated everything, and John proved to be, in the arena of fatherhood, exactly what he was in every other arena, present and methodical and entirely without complaint, rising for the night wakings with a willingness that Rose told him she considered evidence of genuine moral character. Caldwell changed through the early 1880s, as all the cattle towns were changing. The railroad was extending its reach, and the Kishom Trail would not carry cattle forever, and everyone who depended on the trail commerce knew it, even if they chose not to discuss it. Rose watched this with the eye of a businesswoman and began gradually to shift the store's inventory and focus toward the agricultural settlers who were filling in the surrounding land, the farmers and homesteaders who were not going anywhere and who needed supplies of a different kind than the drovers. This proved to be the right instinct. By 1882, the store was the most reliable mercantile in the county, serving a stable and growing customer base, and Rose had paid off the bank debt in full and had enough in reserve to consider expansion. John's work as a deputy evolved as the town evolved. The wildest years of Caldwell, the years of the most violent trail traffic, were winding down, and what replaced them was the quieter but no less complex work of a frontier town becoming something more settled. Land disputes, civil complaints, the occasional outbreak of the old violence, but rarer and rarer. He was respected in Caldwell in the way that men are respected when they have been consistent over years and have never given anyone a reason to doubt their word. In the fall of 1882, Calloway told John that he was thinking of retiring the following year, and that he wanted John to run for sheriff. John came home that evening and told Rose, and she looked at him for a long moment and said, "Do you want it?" "Yes," he said, "but not if it creates a problem." "What kind of problem would it create?" she asked. "The kind where you're married to the sheriff of a cattle town, and that comes with things neither of us can fully predict," he said. Rose put down the dishcloth she had been holding and looked at him. "John," she said, "I have a pistol and I have sense and I have been managing unpredictable things since I was 20. Run for sheriff." He ran. He won in the spring of 1883 with a majority that was less a victory than an inevitability, because by that point the people of Caldwell would simply have been confused by any other outcome. At his swearing-in, Rose stood beside him with 2-year-old Ben on her hip, watching him take the oath with the same quality of absolute certainty with which he had taken all the oaths he had ever made. And she thought of the night he had ridden in on Cooper and she had been on the saloon porch, and none of this had been written anywhere at all. Not the store saved, not the loan settled, not the ring, not the vows, not Ben. Not this moment, and how entirely everything had come from that specific accident of timing and geography, and whatever it is that moves people toward each other when the time is right. In the spring of 1883, with John newly installed as sheriff and Ben approaching his 3rd birthday and the store doing better than it ever had, Rose discovered she was pregnant again. She told John in the kitchen, the same kitchen where she had told him about Ben, and his response was the same uncomplicated joy, and she laughed at the consistency of him, which was one of the things she loved most. She had a harder pregnancy this time, more fatigue, more discomfort, the particular physical difficulty that sometimes comes with the second when the body is not quite the same as it was. John managed the household and Ben and his sheriff's duties with the organized reliability that was simply who he was, and never once made her feel that any of it was more than he was glad to give. Their daughter arrived in December 1883, on a cold, clear night that turned the stars outside the window into something like cut glass. She was smaller than Ben had been, with a quiet watchfulness about her even as a newborn, and she had her father's gray eyes with remarkable clarity. "Clara," Rose said when they were naming her, "for no particular reason except that it suits her." "Clara Shepard," John said, holding her. "Yes, it does suit her." Clara turned out to have a personality that was, in precise terms, the opposite of her brother's. Where Ben was loud and immediate and ran at everything, Clara watched first, assessed, and then acted with a decisive precision that made Rose look at her sometimes with a recognition that was almost unsettling, because it was like looking at a smaller version of John. The house on the west side of Caldwell was expanded in 1884, 2 more rooms added, which John helped to build with the same methodical competence with which he did everything, and which transformed it from a small house into something that felt more properly like a home. Rose put in a proper kitchen garden that summer and grew tomatoes and beans and a profusion of sunflowers along the fence, because she had always wanted a kitchen garden and had never had the space. John built her a proper bookshelf that fall, with careful joinery and good wood, because her 3 books had become 12 and were overflowing the small shelf she had improvised, and he had noticed this without being asked, and made it a project over several evenings in the shed behind the house. When he carried it in and set it against the parlor wall, Rose ran her hand along the smooth wood and said, "You made this." "It's not perfect," he said, with the honest assessment of a man who had measured himself against a high standard. "It's wonderful," she said, looking at him. He shrugged with the modest discomfort of a man who does not take compliments easily, and she crossed the room and kissed him, which he received considerably better. The years moved through the latter part of the 1880s with the particular quality of good years, not without trouble, because life on the frontier was never without trouble but full in the ways that matter. The store thrived. The town grew. Ben grew with it, a boy of tremendous energy and opinions, who by the age of 7 had become the terror of every chicken in a 3-block radius and the general delight of everyone who encountered him. Clara grew quieter and sharper, a child who asked questions that made adults rethink their answers, who had learned to read at a startling speed, and who had, by the age of 4, commandeered 2 of the books from Rose's shelf, and was treating them with the proprietary interest of someone who has recognized their natural territory. Rose and John grew too, through those years, not in ways that were always easy or smooth, because 2 strong-willed people living a real life together are not always smooth, and they had their disagreements and their difficult weeks, and the occasional period of friction that comes from the honest collision of 2 people who are both fundamentally certain about things. But they had, at the center of it, the thing that makes all of that manageable, the absolute knowledge that the other person was not going anywhere. He had promised her that on the very first night, and he had kept it every day since. There was an evening in the summer of 1887. She was 30, he was 34, Ben was 6 and Clara was 3, when they sat on the porch of the expanded house in the warm night, and the children were asleep, and the stars were out in their full Kansas abundance. John had a cup of coffee, and she had a glass of the elderflower cordial she had started making from the bush Mrs. Prout had given her as a wedding present, and they were quiet together in the way they had been quiet together since the very beginning, the comfortable silence of 2 people who do not need to fill every moment with words. "Do you ever think about riding out?" She asked him, not with anxiety but with genuine curiosity. He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes I think about the trail," he said, "the open road of it, the way the country looks from horseback when there's no end to it." He paused. "But riding out means leaving what I have here, and I wouldn't trade what I have here for any of it. Even the mountains," she said, with the memory of that early conversation. "Even the mountains," he said, "though I still intend to take you there someday." She looked at him in the dark. "Is that a promise?" The corner of his mouth moved, and in 8 years she had come to know precisely what that meant. "Yes," he said, "that is a promise." She leaned her head on his shoulder, there on the porch in the summer dark, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there with Caldwell quiet around them and the stars overhead, and the sound of their children breathing inside the house. In the spring of 1889, they took the train west. It was Rose's idea, practically planned and presented, and John's response had been to look at her with something like gratitude and say yes before she had finished the sentence. They left Thomas Greer in charge of the store. He had been managing it capably for years by this point and needed no instruction, and left Deputy Frank Akers, who had grown considerably in competence over the decade, in charge of the sheriff's duties, and they put Ben, who was 8, and Clara, who was 5, on a train to Denver and then southwest into Colorado. The mountains appeared on a morning in April when the train came around a long curve, and there they were, the Rockies, white-tipped and enormous and entirely exceeding anything Rose had imagined. She pressed her face to the window like a child, and Ben pressed his face beside hers with a gasp of pure astonishment, and Clara said, with the precise composure of a 5-year-old who has been thinking about this since she was told it was coming, "There they are." John was watching Rose's face, not the mountains. She turned and caught him watching, and he smiled fully, the full smile she had been collecting since that June evening in 1879. "You promised," she said. "I kept it," he said. They spent 10 days in Colorado, staying at a small boarding house near a town called Salida that sat in a mountain valley with a river running through it, and peaks on every side. They hiked the lower trails with the children, who approached the mountains with their very different personalities in perfect form, Ben running ahead and needing to be retrieved from increasingly ambitious positions, Clara walking carefully and asking the names of every flower and rock she encountered. John knew some of the names and invented plausible-sounding ones for the ones he didn't, which Rose called out once and which made them both laugh. At the end of one of those days, when the children had been put to bed in the boarding house and the mountain air was cold and clear and the peaks were visible in the moonlight, Rose and John sat on the small porch of their room and looked at the mountains in the dark and said very little because some things are sufficient in themselves. "Thank you," Rose said, eventually. "For what specifically?" he said. "For being someone who keeps his word," she said. "For being someone worth trusting." He looked at her, and in the moonlight he looked both older than the young man who had ridden into Caldwell and entirely the same. "You were worth keeping it for," he said. They came home to Caldwell in late April, with a wooden carving Ben had purchased with his own saved coins, and Clara carrying a pressed flower she had collected from the mountain trail, and that she intended to put in a book, which she did, and which was still between the pages of her mother's copy of Great Expectations when she was old enough to understand it. The summer of 1889 arrived in Caldwell with its familiar ferocity, and the store was busy, and the sheriff's duties were their ordinary texture, and Ben had started school with the focused enthusiasm of a child who wanted to know everything, and Clara was beginning to read with a fluency that impressed her teacher, and Rose was coming to the end of her third pregnancy. She told John about the third one on a Monday morning in January, and his response had been exactly the same as both previous times. The complete and simple joy that she had come to understand was not performance but purely him, and she had laughed and said, "You are very consistent." "When I find something good," he said, "I tend to continue finding it good." Their second son arrived on the 17th of July, 1889, on a summer morning with the heat already asserting itself. He was large and calm and looked at the world with a considered expression from the first moment, and Rose, who was 32 and had done this before, felt the same awe as the first time, which she thought said something important about these things. "James," John said, when she suggested it. "James Shepard," he turned it over, "yes." James proved, as he grew into himself over the following years, to be a combination of his parents that neither of them had quite anticipated, practical and warm both, with his mother's ease with people and his father's fundamental steadiness, and something entirely his own that was simply himself. By the time the 1890s arrived, Caldwell was a different kind of town than the one Rose had stood on the saloon porch watching cowboys ride in from the south. The great trail era was over, closed out by the advancing railroad and the spreading settlements, and the town had settled into itself as a proper community, a county seat, with a courthouse and a school and more permanent buildings, and the kind of civic life that develops when people stop passing through and start staying. John had been re-elected sheriff 3 times by this point, each election more settled than the last, because the people of Caldwell had no interest in any other sheriff, and made this clear with the kind of communal certainty that is more compliment than election result. Rose's store had evolved into the most substantial mercantile in the county, expanding its inventory twice and its physical space once, employing 3 people full-time and doing steady business with the farming communities that had grown up on the surrounding land. She kept the accounts herself, because she had always been best at them, and because she found in the precise logic of the numbers something satisfying that other aspects of the work did not provide in the same way. They sat on the porch on a fall evening in 1892. She was 35. He was 39 with Ben 12 and serious about becoming a rancher. Clara 8 and reading everything she could find and declaring her intention to become a teacher. And James 3 and currently asleep and therefore, for the first time all day, not attempting to climb anything. The night was cool in the way of Kansas autumns, with a clarity to the air that made the stars look close. John's coffee cup sat on the porch rail and he had his arm around her and she was leaning into his side, and it was exactly like every other evening they had spent on this porch over the years, and also like no evening that had ever happened before because each one was its own. "Do you remember the first night?" she asked. "The saloon porch," he said immediately. "You touched your hat at me," she said. "You looked like you were making a decision," he said. "I was," she said. "I was deciding whether to go in and find the sheriff. And instead you ended up talking to me," he said. "And instead," she said. He pressed his lips to the top of her hair. "The best accident I ever walked into," he said. She turned her head to look up at him. This man she had known for 13 years. This man who had kept every word he had given her. This man she had built a life with on the edge of the frontier in a town that was becoming the kind of place worth building lives in. This man who had been known across 3 states as the cowboy who never made promises. And she thought of the very first night. The stars and the fiddle and the summer air, and what he had said, and how he had meant it. And how every single day since had been the proof. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said, with the same absolute simplicity he brought to every true thing. The stars were out over Caldwell in their full abundance, and inside the house their children were sleeping or reading or attempting to extract something from a high shelf, and the store was closed and the accounts were balanced, and the mountains had been seen and the promises had been kept. And Rose Bell, who was now Rose Shepard, who had come to this town with a father and a prayer and a pistol, and had built something real and lasting from the materials at hand, rested her head against the shoulder of the man who had ridden in from nowhere and stayed, and felt exactly, precisely, completely what she felt on the first night when he had made her that promise. Certain, safe, home. Years moved forward in the way that years do when a life is good, with a quality of fullness that makes them feel at once too fast and entirely sufficient. Ben Shepard grew into exactly the rancher he had intended to be, purchasing a modest piece of land east of Caldwell at 19, and working it with the stubborn industriousness that was recognizable as both his parents' contribution to his character. By his 22nd year, he had a going concern, and a young woman named Alice who worked at the schoolhouse, and Rose and John attended their wedding in the spring of 1902, with the particular emotional complexity of parents watching a child arrive at their own beginning. Clara became the teacher she had declared she would be at age 8, which surprised no one who had known her at any point in her life. She taught at the Caldwell School from the age of 18, was teaching reading to the youngest students with the same methodical warmth that characterized everything she did, and had her mother's instinct for people and her father's precision in applying it. James grew up to be, in several ways, the most sociable of the 3. He had his mother's ease with people squared by some quality entirely his own. And by the time he was 12, he had become the person that all of Caldwell's children naturally organized around, not because he sought leadership, but because people simply wanted to be near him, which was something that made John look at him sometimes with a recognition he could not quite name. John retired as sheriff in 1898, after 15 years in the office, at 51, which the people of Caldwell acknowledged with a dinner at the church hall that lasted 4 hours, and involved more speeches than anyone had planned, and which Mrs. Prout, who was 73 and still collecting information with undiminished energy, attended and cried through with the same enthusiasm she had brought to John and Rose's wedding 19 years earlier. He spent the years after his retirement in the ways that suited him, helping Ben with the ranch when the work required an extra hand, maintaining the small repair workshop he had set up behind the house where he fixed things that needed fixing for himself and anyone in the town who asked, riding out on Cooper's successor, a steady roan named Atlas, on the afternoons when he wanted to feel the open country again without going anywhere in particular. Rose was 50 in 1907, and the store was 31 years old as her enterprise, and she held a party at the store on the anniversary of her taking it over, which had been the day after her father's funeral, which she chose to commemorate not with grief but with gratitude for the thing her father had built, and for what she had made of it, and for the life that had grown around it in ways he had not lived to see. John stood beside her at the party with his hand at the small of her back, as he had stood beside her in 1,000 moments and 1,000 rooms over the years, and when she looked at him, he was looking at her with the same steady gray eyes that had looked at her across the bar of the Dust and Bloom saloon on the night he rode into Caldwell, and it was still the same look, that particular quality of being seen clearly and entirely and gladly. Ben brought Alice and their 2 children, a boy named Bernard for his grandfather and a girl named Emma. Clara was there with several of her students whom she had brought along because they had asked to come, and she could not find a good reason to refuse them, which was very Clara. James, 17 and already 6 feet tall and finding the world extremely interesting, was everywhere at once, talking to everyone, helping carry things, making his mother laugh twice in rapid succession with something she did not catch. She stood in the middle of it all, her store, her family, her town, the life she had made, and felt the completeness of it. Later that evening, when the party was done and the children had gone home and the grandchildren were asleep in the spare room, Rose and John sat on the porch in the warm summer night. He had his coffee and she had her elderflower cordial, the same as always, the same as it had been since Mrs. Prout's bush grew large enough to make it from an abundance. The stars were out. "It's been a good life," she said. "The best," he said, and he meant it precisely. She looked at him. "Do you remember what you promised me?" "The very first thing you promised me on that night at the social." He was quiet for a moment, remembering. "That I would not disappear on you," he said. "That you would not wake up one morning and find me gone without a word." 28 years, she said. 28 years, he said. She reached over and took his hand, and he held hers in the way he had held it for 28 years, firm and warm and entirely without the possibility of letting go. "Are you planning on disappearing any time soon?" she said. "No," he said. "I am not." "Good," she said. They sat there in the summer dark with the stars overhead and Caldwell around them, and the grandchildren sleeping inside, and their whole life laid out behind them and still ahead of them both, and Rose Bell, who was Rose Shepard, who had come to this town with a prayer and stayed for everything, listened to the warm Kansas night and was at peace. The cowboy who never made promises had made her one on the very first night, and in keeping it had given her the world.